This is Africa in the 21st century, a place of unparalleled natural splendor, a land of milk, honey, and opportunities. Africa has a rich culture that is unique and diverse, with great craftsmanship, magical tribal dancing, and fabulous musicians. Africa is a place where vibrant and diverse culture intertwines with modernization and the contemporary marketplace. The scenic beauty of Africa makes the continent a photographer's paradise. The continent has an abundance of human and natural resources, supplying most of the world's demand for mineral resources, including crude oil and diamonds. Africa has an untapped investment capabilities with enormous potential for highly profitable investment across different sectors, with several African countries having become some of the best economic performers globally. Despite these potentials, the biggest challenge that impacts on the continent's long-term development and competitiveness is corruption.
Africa, arise! Let's fight corruption in our continent. In our continent, Africa, arise. Let's fight corruption in our continent. In our continent. If we fight against corruption.
Corruption is a global phenomenon that is endemic in Africa.
Corruption is a global phenomenon. There's nothing African about corruption. It's a vice that afflicts all societies across the world. Corruption is as old as human history. So for people to say that corruption is more African is absolutely incorrect. It's a global phenomenon. Perhaps why it looks more profound in Africa is simply because of the size of our economies. Our economies are relatively small. Our GDP is small. Our per capita income is small compared to the rest of the world. So its effect is felt more on the African continent than other regions of the world, because Africa is the least developed region amongst all regions of the world. So to that effect, it's felt more on the African continent. It's not that it's less in other parts of the world. The global economic crisis that the world was confronted with, which started in the United States, spilled over to Europe and other parts of the world, was a product of corruption, basically.
Despite the vast opportunities for Africa's long-term growth and competitiveness, corruption on the continent is a serious hindrance regarding the actual realization of Africa's full potential, particularly in terms of socio-economic development.
We all know that corruption costs Africa a very huge amount of money. Only recently, the World Bank revealed that corruption is responsible for the increase in costs of goods and services in Africa by as much as 20%. According to the report, Africa also loses approximately $150 billion annually to corruption. And this amounts to an estimated 25% of Africa's total GDP. This must be a very worrying development to us, and therefore fighting corruption in Africa must occupy center stage of every government if we are to improve the lives of our people. Africa needs to stand up against corruption, and we must do so together. Corruption is no longer a local or domestic affair, but a transnational phenomenon that affects all societies, nations, and economies. Indeed, corruption knows no borders. As such, international cooperation to prevent and control corruption is imperative.
There are a constellation of factors that make Africa susceptible to corruption, including historical, socio-economic, and political dynamics that contribute to this.
The economies of many countries across the continent are still primarily dependent on natural resources and in many cases still dominated by the extractive sector. Now, firstly, this prefers a number of opportunities for economic growth, as in the case of resource-rich countries. However, the reliance on natural resources creates a number of susceptibilities in terms of fueling corrupt and dubious business practices, as well as internal strife and conflict arising out of the quest for control and allocation of these scarce resources. Properly managing the revenues that arise from natural resources is absolutely critical in order to contribute to the long-term sustainability and economic growth of these countries. And these require that the forces of public and economic governance be converged within a culture of the cardinal principles of accountability, transparency, responsibility, and fairness.
Other drivers of corruption in Africa include the link between economic and political governance and the exploitation of public office for private benefit.
There's evidence of a system in which there are gaps and there are just a number of ways in which unscrupulous individuals can essentially take advantage of weak regulations and poor enforcement and poor oversight to milk the system for their own personal benefits.
If you think about one head of state richer than his own country, we have had it in Africa. You know, where did he get the money from when he came to power as a pauper? Not better than me.
Corruption may be part of the process of primitive capital accumulation, if we're using, that kind of academic language about it. Yes, but it must not be such that compromise the basic essence of society. If it does, society will completely collapse. And that's what we see in some African countries, in which corruption has virtually depleted society completely, because it's compromised the basic necessities of life which the people should have.
Also noteworthy are the abuse of cultural practices that facilitate corruption. For instance, the cultural practice of giving token gifts as a courtesy during meetings presents an opportunity for misuse.
L'argent qu'on doit toucher pour signer un contrat, caché. Et l'argent là, il est placé dans une banque. Et l'argent là, il est investi, ça retourne dans le pays. Mais pas pour le pays, mais pour le chef. C'est ça l'enrichissement illicite. Et ça, les mécanismes, nous avons chapitre 5 de la Convention qui indique les moyens pour lutter contre l'enrichissement illicite et le blanchiment d'argent. Au niveau de toutes les banques, il y a un système d'alerte qui veille sur les gros montants.
We need to have leaders within government and the political engine who are willing to actually do business differently. In Africa, most of us know and understand that most of the public resources are lost because politicians and government officials end up taking a cut for whatever contracts they hand out. Sometimes even within the private sector that does happen, but the impact that you then have on development is detrimental.
Further challenges facing the reform in Africa include the quality of regulatory and institutional framework to promote transparency and accountability.
You have to strengthen the legislative framework. You need a very strong legal basis before you can attack and handle corruption. In the absence of a strong legislative framework, every attempt to fight corruption will fail. If even you attempt in any form, the first challenge you encounter in court, it will collapse the infrastructure.
Notable in this regard is the capacity for reform and enforcement, considering that public services across the continent are unevenly provided and of poor quality. And in many instances, civil servants are often so badly paid that they have to resort to petty corruption in order to survive. Also, the institutions that are intended to provide checks and balances within the system, including the prosecuting authorities, are often generally under-resourced and lack the requisite skills, infrastructure, and independence. It is absolutely necessary for governments to find ways and means of promoting and facilitating as well as regulating cooperation among state parties of the African Union in order to ensure effectiveness of measures and actions that are in place to detect, punish, eradicate and prevent corruption in Africa. In order to promote an accountable and transparent governance system that is aimed at ensuring the long-term growth and development of Africa, a firm commitment to fight corruption by African states must exist, and such a commitment can only be achieved through political will.
Corruption is, without a doubt, a problem. It's even though we have been making strides in fighting it, even though there have been improvements in the amount of corruption that exists, especially since we returned to democratic governance from 1992, it's still certainly a very big problem in Ghana. And the primary reason really is that the systems for fighting corruption are not properly institutionalized. And by that I mean we don't have proper enforcement mechanisms in place to create a deterrent against corrupt acts being taken place by public officials. The system we have in our country, the constitutional system here, concentrates a lot of power in the executive and executive agencies. And the executive agencies are, on the one hand, agencies that are supposed to fight corruption, and on the other hand, they are the agencies that have the greatest opportunity to engage in corruption. So the existence of mechanisms, effective mechanisms to fight corruption, they're just not present. So we do have a problem here, particularly when it comes to coming up with ways to enforce existing laws on corruption.
The continent's dark history of autocratic and unaccountable governments, as well as conflicts and crises in many parts of the continent, have posed particular challenges to improving governance and fighting against corruption in Africa.
Unfortunately, many parts of Africa are characterized by a proliferation of weak governance zones, where governments are unwilling or unable to discharge their responsibilities in relation to good public administration. Incidentally, progress is often slow, even in those countries where the political will to reform exists. And many a times this is as a result of resistance to reform by groups and individuals that are benefiting from the status quo.
There is no doubt that fighting corruption requires a serious tone from the top. In this regard, several African leaders have been vocal in advocating for reform and expressing their political will to fight corruption. In his keynote address during the second assembly of the Association of African Anti-Corruption Agencies held in Accra, the President of Ghana, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, reiterated the position of his government with regards to fighting corruption.
The fight against corruption continues to be a key priority for us here in Ghana. We continue to strengthen the legal and institutional framework against corruption. We have passed a number of anti-corruption legislation, including the Public Procurement Act, the Whistleblower Act, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, and a Right to Information Bill is also currently under consideration by Parliament, while a Witness Protection Bill is also being worked on by the Attorney General's Office. The Code of Conduct Bill for Public Officers, which is a new bill expected to check corruption in the public sector, was approved by Cabinet. The bill will give legal backing to the Code of Ethics for Ministers of State and other political appointees, and also elaborate on our constitutional provisions on conflict of interest situations for public officers, and generally enhance our efforts to run a clean, open, and transparent and accountable administration. The Constitutional Review Commission's recommendations have a significant anti-corruption content, Some of the provisions in the bill are aimed at, one, empowering our Anti-Corruption Commission, that is the TRAJ, to conduct investigations in all matters, even in the absence of a formal complaint. Two, to widen the definition of corruption to encompass all corruption-related offenses provided under the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. Three, to make decisions of the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice directly enforceable. And four, to strengthen the assets disclosure regime for public officers. Five, to better regulate the regime for gifts to public officers. And six, to establish a democracy fund to ensure sustainable funding for anti-corruption agencies. And seven, to revise the rules of evidence to shift the burden of proof onto a person alleged to have been bribed, where that person admits the receipt of a monetary or other advantage but denies that what was received amounted to a bribe. When all these are achieved in the near future, Ghana would have created a fairly solid legal and institutional framework to combat corruption. Let me, however, admit that the passage of bills alone cannot prevent corruption. Enforcement is the key. Again, one of the very first decisions I took as president was to appoint a commission to investigate the untoward payment of judgment debts. The revelations so far made are very worrying, but they provide us with a basis for taking concrete action to stem such corruption in future. More recently, I have directed the Attorney General and Minister of Justice to set up a special desk in her office to investigate and prosecute all offenders against whom adverse findings have been made in the reports of the Auditor General. This directive and its implementation is part of efforts towards stemming the massive theft of public revenue through corruption in the public sector. I assure you that my government will remain committed to the fight against graft, and we welcome any initiatives that seek to advance this cause.
In a similar vein, during the country's mission of the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption to Cameroon, the Minister of Good Governance in the country reiterated the stance of the government of Cameroon against corruption with the leadership of His Excellency Paul Biya.
Le dispositif national est là. Nous avons le contrôle supérieur de l'État comme l'institution supérieure de contrôle. Nous avons placé sur l'autorité du président de la République. Nous avons une commission nationale anti-corruption placée sur l'autorité du président de la République. Nous avons la Chambre des comptes de la Cour suprême du Cameroun spécialisée dans le jugement des comptes des comptables publics au Cameroun. Nous avons d'autres structures qui participent de la formation. En somme, en liaison avec les administrations financières, nous avons une institution qui s'occupe également de la détection, un bureau de renseignement financier dans ce domaine-là, sous l'autorité du ministre des Finances. C'est tout un système qui est mobilisé dans cette direction. La volonté politique y est. Les actions se mènent et le processus est en cours. Le président de la République conduit ce combat qui est contre un phénomène mondial. Et nous maintiendrons le cap et les procédures suivront leur cours au fur et à mesure que les circonstances permettront le parachèvement de la procédure.
By pledging the support of their regimes towards fighting corruption, the governments of Ghana and Cameroon have voiced out political will, which is a necessary condition for fighting corruption. We engage with a number of experts in order to further elucidate on the issue of political will regarding the fight against corruption on the continent.
I think for leaders, showing that they are committed to anti-corruption, making statement after statement against corruption, even if it sounds tiring, they have to do that because the anti-corruption agencies need to know that their leaders have their back.
Les chefs de gouvernement, les chefs d'État doivent prendre un engagement sérieux dans la lutte contre la corruption, c'est-à-dire ce qui est nécessaire, c'est uniquement la volonté politique. Si le chef d'État est engagé, si le chef de gouvernement est engagé, c'est-à-dire que toutes les institutions étatiques, c'est-à-dire que tous les pouvoirs, c'est-à-dire que tous les services publics seront engagés. En cas du contraire, ils seront punis lorsqu'il y a la volonté politique.
The political will to address corruption is certainly present on its face. So if one is looking for public comments by public officials that seek to condemn corruption, that supports anti-corruption initiatives, anti-corruption initiatives, that's certainly there. But the challenge is actually translating all that evidence of interest and all that statements of intention to actual tangible actions.
And we see examples on the continent. We see the example of Rwanda, which is absolute zero tolerance of corruption, and a relatively poor country doing dramatically well, in terms of its performance. I mean, it's a strange thing in Rwanda, to see people giving bribes. So it's close to zero. It's not going to happen, because you see leadership by example. You see also a zero tolerance level of it by the political leadership to ensure that institutions work, and whoever is culpable is simply dealt with by that institution. That's what political will means, and this is something that is commended to all African leaders to emulate in terms of a zero tolerance level and absolute leadership by example.
There is a lot of leaders that are taking a stand and are making sure that there's no impunity. It's just a question of making sure that there's uniformity in the continent, and ultimately that we strengthen good governance, because corruption comes after the systems have failed. When the system works, there's less people that are prepared to take chances, and much less of them that can get away with it.
A number of experts argue that political will does not pertain to political leaders and senior government officials alone, but must involve collective action by citizens in general.
Political will is indeed very important, but let me tell you frankly that I personally do not think that it's a real issue. Simply because political will should be the will of the people and not the will of the rulers. So as long as we are in a democratic system where the will of the people is there, the rulers, the politicians will have to follow the will of the people, and that's the political will.
We need to make the anti-corruption campaign a whole societal campaign, a campaign that takes place in schools, in the private sector, everywhere.
At a continental level, the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption provides a strong indication of political will for the fight against corruption in Africa.
The African Union Advisory Board on Corruption has its roots and its legal basis in the African Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. If you look at that particular convention of 2003, there is a provision there which states that this board has to be established. So it has the basis in law. And it was established by the heads of state and government of the African Union. So it also has political authority, as it were. Its mandate is basically to, if I can put it that way, oversee the fight against corruption on the African continent and work with critical stakeholders in the fight against corruption, and advise Africa's political leaders through its reporting process in terms of where the continent is, what the continent needs to do, and how the continent should do it. So it reports through the Executive Council en route to the heads of state and government of the African Union. So in a sense, it has political authority in fighting corruption on the African continent.
A key function of the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption is to advocate and encourage the member states of the African Union to sign, ratify, and domesticate the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption.
Political will is about to domesticate the convention and make the convention live, breathing life in the country responsible for its implementation. And here we have not seen much activity in the most of African countries. Only a few, handful, that have domesticated the convention. There are more countries of Africa domesticated the United Nations Convention Against Corruption than their own convention. As far as I'm concerned, I think we have now 34 countries which have ratified the convention, and hardly, perhaps the 13 countries which have domesticated out of 54 countries, including South Sudan. So it's a major challenge, and that's where the political will comes in.
Dans la corruption, dans la corruption, Africa dans la corruption, à la corruption, on fait d'accentuer famine, conséquences maladie, à cause de la corruption.
Riche continent, dépourvu d'évolution due à la mauvaise gouvernance politique et financière, nos richesses volées, une éducation corrompue qui promouvoit la voyoucratie sénile dans les rues d'Afrique. Lève-toi Afrique, et bats-toi contre la corruption qui détruit les mœurs et ton avenir.